The father opened his daughter's coffin and found his wife's skeleton inside, with a small map stitched into the bone. Maria Jenkins had been dead for 3 days, her body prepared for burial alongside her mother's remains, a request in her suicide note. But what mortician Thomas Reynolds discovered that morning defied all explanation. The young woman's once pale skin now had a marble-like translucence, and thin blue veins formed what appeared to be a cartographic pattern across her chest. When Reynolds tried to adjust her burial gown, Maria's eyes snapped open, and she whispered coordinates that matched the stitched map on her mother's skeletal remains. Dr. Edward Blackwood had been a respected medical examiner for 23 years before being called to the Reynolds funeral home that foggy October morning. His hands trembled as he examined the body of 28-year-old Maria Jenkins, a woman he had personally pronounced dead 72 hours earlier after an apparent overdose. "This is medically impossible," he muttered, pressing his stethoscope against her chest. The heartbeat was unmistakable, faint and irregular, but definitely present. More disturbing was the network of blue lines that had emerged beneath her skin, forming what appeared to be a crude map. "I've never seen anything like this," Blackwood admitted, his professional composure cracking. "The patterns on her skin, they're not bruising, not lividity. It's as if her veins have rearranged themselves." He carefully photographed the strange markings before turning his attention to the other occupant of the coffin, the skeletal remains of Eleanor Jenkins, Maria's mother, who had died 15 years earlier. Eleanor's bones had been exhumed the previous day, following instructions in Maria's suicide note requesting that mother and daughter be buried together. But what horrified Blackwood wasn't the presence of the skeleton. It was the meticulous stitching embedded in the bones. Someone had drilled tiny holes into the ribcage and shoulder blades, threading blue silk through them to create a pattern identical to the one now appearing on Maria's skin. "This is desecration," Blackwood whispered. "Who would do this to human remains?" His assistant, normally stoic through the most gruesome autopsies, excused herself and vomited in the bathroom. The young woman returned minutes later, her face ashen, only to collapse when she saw that the blue threads in Eleanor's bones had begun to glow with a faint phosphorescence that pulsed in perfect synchrony with Maria's awakening heartbeat. When Maria's father, Professor James Jenkins, arrived at the funeral home, his reaction wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of shock or horror at his daughter's impossible revival, he simply nodded, as if confirming something he had long feared. "They've found us," he said quietly, reaching into the coffin to trace the map on his daughter's chest with trembling fingers. "After all these years, they've found us." The funeral director tried to intervene, suggesting the professor was in shock, but Jenkins pushed him aside with surprising strength for a man in his 70s. He leaned close to his daughter's ear and whispered something in a language no one recognized. Maria's body convulsed, her back arching violently as her eyes flew open, revealing pupils that had changed from brown to a luminescent blue. 43.7968 north, 11.4997 east, she recited in a voice that didn't sound entirely human. Then her eyes locked with her father's. "Mother says you must finish what you started." Blood trickled from the corners of her eyes, forming tiny tributaries that followed the blue lines across her skin, enriching the map with crimson details that hadn't been visible before. Professor Jenkins collapsed to the floor, clutching his chest. As paramedics rushed in, they found him drawing the same map pattern in his own blood on the funeral home floor. "The Vatican archives," he gasped before losing consciousness. "The missing pages, Voynich manuscript, they're coming back through the gates." The paramedic who tried to wipe away Jenkins' blood drawing recoiled in horror as the blood resisted, crawling back into position like a sentient organism determined to complete its cartographic mission. What followed was a desperate race to understand what was happening to Maria Jenkins and her family. Hospital staff reported that Maria's condition defied medical explanation. Her body temperature fluctuated wildly, sometimes dropping so low that frost formed on her skin, other times rising so high that water boiled when it touched her. The strange map-like pattern continued to spread across her body, growing more detailed with each passing hour. Meanwhile, authorities discovered that Professor James Jenkins wasn't merely a retired history professor, as everyone believed. Declassified documents revealed he had once led a classified research team for the government, investigating ancient cartographic anomalies, maps that supposedly led to places that shouldn't exist. His team had mysteriously disbanded after a disastrous expedition to northern Italy 15 years earlier, the same expedition from which his wife Eleanor had never returned alive. The Jenkins case, as it became known among the investigators, took an even more disturbing turn when forensic analysts examined Eleanor Jenkins' remains more closely. The blue thread stitched through her bones wasn't thread at all. It was a fungal growth, a previously unknown species that had somehow been manipulating the skeletal structure. More horrifying, samples of the fungus were still alive, despite the bones being interred for 15 years. Under the microscope, the fungal filaments appeared to be arranged in patterns resembling circuitry. Organic technology of impossible sophistication. Dr. Sarah Patel, a mycologist called in to examine the fungal samples, became the first casualty of the investigation. Security footage from her laboratory showed her working late, examining the samples under a microscope. At exactly 3:33 in the morning, she suddenly stood up, walked to the wall, and began drawing the same map pattern with a marker. She worked feverishly for hours until the pattern covered the entire laboratory. Then, without warning, she plunged a scalpel into her own throat. As she collapsed, the cameras captured a final, chilling detail. The fungal sample appeared to pulse with light in perfect synchronization with her fading heartbeat, and microscopic filaments began to grow outward from the sample dish, reaching toward her fallen body like hungry fingers. The laboratory was immediately quarantined, but by morning, the fungus had disappeared entirely, leaving behind only the map drawn in Dr. Patel's blood. Technicians wearing hazmat suits reported feeling an overwhelming compulsion to follow the lines of the map with their fingers, and 3 had to be physically restrained when they began scratching the pattern into their own skin. Forensic luminol tests revealed that beneath the visible blood map, identical patterns had been drawn and cleaned away dozens of times over the years, suggesting that Dr. Patel had been secretly enacting this ritual for months before her death. 5 researchers who viewed this footage subsequently reported the same nightmare: a vast underground chamber beneath an ancient church, where thousands of skeletons had been arranged to form a massive 3-dimensional map. In the center of this macabre atlas stood Eleanor Jenkins, her bones now completely overtaken by the luminescent blue fungus, pointing to a location marked the first gate. In each dream, Eleanor's skull turned to face the dreamer, her eye sockets filled with the glowing fungus, and whispered, "We've been waiting for cartographers worthy of the journey." 2 of these researchers disappeared the following day. Their apartments were found empty except for the now familiar map pattern drawn across every wall, ceiling, and floor in substances ranging from ink to excrement. The sheets on their beds had been meticulously folded and cut to replicate topographical features found on the map. When authorities attempted to remove these items as evidence, they discovered the fabrics had been fused to the floor with a biological adhesive chemically identical to human bone cement. The coordinates Maria had recited led to a small, seemingly abandoned chapel outside Florence, Italy. When authorities finally gained access to the site, what they found contradicted all historical records. The chapel, supposedly built in the 15th century, contained technology that couldn't possibly have existed at that time. Brass and copper devices reminiscent of astronomical instruments, but designed to measure something other than celestial bodies. Carbon dating placed the metal components at over 8,000 years old, though metallurgy of such sophistication shouldn't have existed in that era. Most disturbing of all was the chapel's floor, a massive stone relief map that perfectly matched the pattern on Maria's skin and her mother's bones. Deep channels carved into the stone were filled with a desiccated blue substance that authorities initially mistook for aged paint. Laboratory analysis revealed it to be the same fungal organism found on Eleanor's remains, but in a dormant state. When exposed to moisture, specifically human blood, the fungus reanimated almost instantaneously. The technician who made this discovery lost 4 fingers to rapid tissue necrosis before the sample could be contained. His dying words, recorded by a lab assistant, were, "I can see through. The door is open. They're waiting for their cartographer." Professor Jenkins regained consciousness after 3 days, immediately demanding paper and pen. With shaking hands, he drew the same map that was spreading across his daughter's skin, adding details no one had seen before, notation in a language that linguists couldn't identify. "They're not coordinates to a place," he explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're coordinates in time." His hands had developed severe tremors, except when drawing the map. Then they moved with mechanical precision, as if guided by an external force. According to Jenkins, his wife Eleanor hadn't been studying ancient maps as her academic credentials suggested. She had been creating them. Maps to navigate what he called thin places, where the boundaries between different times could be traversed. Eleanor found a way through, he said, but something followed her back. As he spoke, small blue filaments could be seen growing beneath his fingernails, spreading through his hands like delicate root systems. The fungus, Jenkins explained between bouts of delirium, wasn't from our world or our time. It was a sentinel organism, designed to create biological anchors across temporal boundaries. Eleanor had become its first host during an expedition to the chapel 15 years ago. She had sacrificed herself to close the gateway, using her own body as a seal. Now, that seal was breaking. Jenkins confessed that he had personally stitched the map pattern into his wife's bones after her death, following her explicit instructions, an act he believed would permanently close the temporal gateway. Instead, it had created a bridge. "They've been waiting for thousands of years," Jenkins muttered, his eyes now showing flecks of the same luminescent blue that had overtaken his daughters. The mothers of cartography, beings that exist in the folds between moments, mapping pathways through time itself. They've chosen Maria as their new vessel, their cartographer. When asked who they were, Jenkins smiled cryptically. Not who, when. They are from a time before time had direction, when past and future were geographical locations one could visit, like Paris or Rome. They want to restore that. Flexibility. As Jenkins spoke, medical staff noticed that the clock in his hospital room had begun to malfunction, the second hand moving sometimes forward, sometimes backward, occasionally freezing altogether. Electronic devices brought near his bed developed similar anomalies, with digital timestamps randomly jumping forward or backward by exactly 13 minutes and 33 seconds. Maria's condition continued to deteriorate, or transform, depending on one's perspective. The map pattern now covered 90% of her body, and she spoke only in coordinates and fragments of the unknown language. Medical instruments near her malfunctioned, and nurses reported that sometimes, when viewed from the corner of one's eye, Maria appeared to be in two places simultaneously. Objects in her room would mysteriously relocate, and several staff members reported seeing her standing at the foot of their beds at night, though security footage showed she never left her room. Most disturbing were the temporal anomalies that followed her. Clocks near Maria would run backward. Flowers in her room would unwilt and return to bud stage, and a nurse's recently healed scar spontaneously reopened when she entered the room. Government physicists brought in to study the phenomenon detected significant irregularities in background radiation and gravity waves around Maria's bed. One physicist theorized that she was becoming a temporal junction point, a nexus where multiple timelines converged. In layman's terms, Maria Jenkins was becoming a human wormhole, a doorway through which something was preparing to enter our reality. The physicist who proposed this theory was found the next morning with his eyes transformed into the same glowing blue as Maria's, repeatedly writing the coordinates to the Italian chapel on every surface he could reach. 8 days after Maria's impossible awakening, Professor Jenkins disappeared from his hospital room. Security cameras showed nothing. One moment he was there, the next his bed was empty. The only clue was a single sheet of paper on which he had written, "I'm going to find Eleanor and bring her home. The gate will open at the winter solstice. If we don't return, burn both our bodies and scatter the ashes at sea." Forensic analysis of the note revealed trace amounts of human tissue in the ink. Jenkins had written it with a mixture of ink and his own blood, which now contained significant concentrations of the blue fungal organism. The winter solstice was 3 weeks away. Government officials, now fully aware of the situation's gravity, debated what to do with Maria. Some advocated following Jenkins' instructions preemptively, cremating Maria, despite her still being alive, to prevent whatever was happening from progressing further. Others insisted she was the only link to understanding the phenomenon and must be studied. The debate became academic when 3 officials who had advocated for her destruction were found in their homes, their bodies desiccated as if aged hundreds of years overnight, with the map pattern carved into their withered skin. While authorities deliberated, a night nurse made a shocking discovery. Maria's hospital room was empty, the window open to the cold December air. But instead of footprints leading away, they found something incomprehensible. The floor around her bed was covered in a fine blue powder, arranged in the now familiar map pattern, with a perfect circle melted into the center of the linoleum floor. The circle wasn't merely burned into the floor. It was a perfect void, a hole that seemed to descend endlessly, though objects dropped into it never made a sound of impact. Even more inexplicably, video footage showed that Maria hadn't walked out. Instead, she had appeared to fold into herself, collapsing into a single point that expanded into the circular void before closing again, leaving only the powder pattern behind. The hospital room became a nexus of temporal disturbances. Clocks refused to function within 20 feet of the circle. People who spent more than a few minutes in the room reported experiencing their own memories out of order, childhood recollections intruding into present consciousness, future events they hadn't yet experienced suddenly becoming vivid memories. 2 security guards stationed at the door aged decades overnight, their bodies showing the cellular damage of men 30 years older than their chronological age. Dr. Blackwood, who had been documenting the case from the beginning, found himself uniquely affected by Maria's disappearance. He began experiencing lost time, blackouts during which, according to witnesses, he would recite coordinates and draw fragments of the map. After one such episode, he discovered his arm was now marked with the same blue pattern that had covered Maria's body. When he attempted to surgically remove the affected skin, the scalpel passed through his flesh without cutting it, as if that portion of his body existed in a different phase of reality. It's contagious, he realized with horror. Not like a conventional pathogen, it spreads through information itself. By studying the map, by understanding it, we become part of it. Blackwood's medical knowledge led him to a disturbing conclusion. The fungus wasn't merely an organism, but a form of temporal cancer, metastasizing across both space and time, using human minds as vectors. Knowledge of the map was the infection. Understanding its significance was the disease. As the winter solstice approached, strange phenomena were reported around the Florence chapel. Local residents spoke of lights appearing and disappearing, of sounds that seemed to come from beneath the earth. Wildlife fled the area, and electronics failed within a mile radius of the structure. Most disturbing were reports that people in the vicinity were experiencing shared hallucinations. Visions of a vast city of impossible architecture superimposed over the existing landscape, visible for just moments before disappearing again. Satellite imagery captured inexplicable temporal anomalies around the chapel. Photographs taken seconds apart showed the building in different states of repair. Sometimes a ruin, sometimes pristine, sometimes with architectural features that had never existed. In one sequence, the chapel appeared to be surrounded by a sprawling complex of structures that architectural historians identified as combining elements from vastly different time periods: Sumerian ziggurats alongside Victorian ironwork and technological elements that reminded witnesses of advanced circuit boards. Despite government containment efforts, images of the map had leaked online. Internet users around the world began reporting dreams of the skeleton chamber and the blue fungus. Some started drawing the patterns compulsively. In a particularly disturbing case, 12 university students in Boston were found catatonic in their dormitory, having covered every surface with the map and arranged themselves in a pattern matching the skeletal configuration from the nightmare. When authorities entered the room, all 12 students simultaneously opened their eyes, revealing the now familiar blue glow, and spoke in unison. "The cartographers are coming home. The mothers will walk again." Digital analysis of social media revealed that the map pattern had begun appearing in art, architecture, and design worldwide. Subtle at first, then increasingly overt. A new cryptocurrency emerged based on blockchain patterns that, when visualized, formed segments of the map. Fashion designers incorporated the patterns into their work, claiming they came to them in dreams. Musicians reported hearing melodies that, when rendered as waveforms, traced perfect segments of the map. The pattern was spreading mimetically through human culture itself, preparing the world for something yet to come. On December 21st, the winter solstice, Dr. Blackwood broke through the security perimeter around the chapel, the blue patterns now covering most of his visible skin. He carried with him Maria's medical charts and a vial of the fungal culture. Authorities lost track of him inside the chapel, but thermal imaging showed a sudden temperature spike in the crypt below, so intense that it overwhelmed their sensors. Quantum measurements taken by nearby research equipment recorded a momentary singularity, a point where the laws of physics appeared to break down entirely, as if reality itself had been punctured. What happened next was witnessed by 27 different people, including military personnel, scientists, and local law enforcement. The chapel appeared to fold in on itself, not collapsing, but somehow turning inside out, revealing spaces and geometries that shouldn't have been possible. For 7 minutes and 13 seconds, where the chapel had stood, observers saw what they could only describe as a city of impossible architecture, before the structure reverted to its original form. Those who stared directly at the phenomenon reported seeing enormous figures moving through the impossible city, beings whose anatomies seemed to extend in directions beyond the 3 dimensions of normal space. 3 observers who maintained visual contact throughout the event suffered catastrophic cellular breakdown, their bodies aging approximately 70 years within minutes. Their final garbled communications described seeing women tall as mountains, with bodies like moving maps, and the mothers returning through the gate. Before dying, each drew a small fragment of the map pattern, which when combined formed new coordinates, pointing to 27 different locations around the world. When teams finally entered the chapel an hour later, they found 3 bodies in the crypt: Professor Jenkins, Dr. Blackwood, and a woman tentatively identified as Eleanor Jenkins, not a skeleton, but a perfectly preserved body that appeared to have died only hours earlier, despite having been buried 15 years before. All 3 were arranged around a central altar, their bodies forming points of a triangle. The blue fungal patterns had burned themselves into the stone floor beneath them, creating a complex circuit-like design that appeared to be channeling some form of energy into the center of their triangle. Forensic analysis revealed that all 3 bodies had been transformed at the cellular level. Their DNA showed unprecedented mutations, incorporating sequences that geneticists claimed couldn't possibly have evolved on Earth. More disturbingly, their brain tissue had been extensively remodeled, with neural pathways reconfigured into patterns that neurologists described as optimized for processing 5-dimensional spatial information. In layman's terms, their brains had been rewired to perceive and navigate dimensions beyond normal human experience. Of Maria Jenkins, there was no sign. However, a 4th depression in the dust of the crypt floor indicated that another body had been present and then removed. Analysis of trace evidence in this depression found cellular material matching Maria's DNA, but with even more extensive mutations than the other 3 bodies. Theoretical physicists brought in to study the case proposed that Maria had undergone complete temporal displacement. Her physical form had been pulled entirely into another point in time. The official report, most of which remains classified, concluded that Professor Jenkins and his wife had been involved in experimental temporal research outside of any governmental oversight. The fungal organism was classified as an unknown biological agent, possibly engineered for purposes not fully understood. All samples were ordered destroyed, and the chapel was filled with concrete and buried beneath tons of earth. Satellite monitoring was established to ensure no further activity occurred at the site. But the story doesn't end there. The concrete entombing the chapel began to develop hairline fractures within days, fractures that, when mapped, formed fragments of the now familiar pattern. Ground-penetrating radar showed impossible voids forming beneath the structure, spaces that seemed to expand and contract rhythmically, like a beating heart. 3 months after the winter solstice incident, hospital staff in 27 different countries reported the same inexplicable event. At exactly 3:33 in the morning local time, every patient named Maria, Mary, Mariam, or any variation thereof momentarily exhibited the blue map pattern across their skin before it faded away. In each case, medical equipment recorded a 13-second temporal anomaly where these patients appeared to exist in a quantum superposition, simultaneously present and absent. Doctors who touched these patients during the event described feeling as if their hands passed through multiple versions of the same person, and several developed the telltale blue patterns on their own fingertips in the following days. Theoretical physicists theorized that these events represented temporal echoes of whatever had happened to Maria Jenkins, ripples spreading backward and forward through time, affecting individuals who shared her name. More concerning were the documented cases of newborn girls being spontaneously named Maria by parents who had planned entirely different names, claiming they heard the name in a dream or felt an overwhelming compulsion to choose it. Birth records showed a 500% increase in variations of the name within 6 months of the solstice incident. One of the government scientists who had been present at the chapel began tracking the coordinates that had been drawn by the dying observers. Each pointed to locations with no apparent connection: a remote mountainside in Peru, an unremarkable suburban intersection in Tokyo, a patch of empty desert in Australia, a shopping mall in Toronto. What linked these places became clear only when he overlaid the locations on a global map. Together, they formed another fragment of the larger pattern, with the Italian chapel at its center. Expeditions to several of these locations revealed subtle anomalies. The Peruvian mountainside contained a cave system whose walls were coated with the blue fungal organism, growing in patterns that local archaeologists confirmed no known indigenous art style. The Tokyo intersection experienced regular traffic light malfunctions where all signals displayed blue instead of their normal colors for precisely 13 seconds at 3:33 each morning. Ground-penetrating radar in the Australian desert revealed an enormous underground structure of unknown origin, its layout matching a section of the map pattern. Most disturbing was what researchers found beneath the Toronto shopping mall. During renovation work, construction crews broke through to a previously unknown sub-basement containing thousands of mannequins arranged in patterns matching the skeletal configuration from the researchers' shared nightmare. Each mannequin had been meticulously modified, with tiny holes drilled into the plastic bones and threaded with blue fibers. The mall had been built in 1983, exactly 40 years before the solstice incident, and no record existed of who had created this macabre installation or how it had remained undiscovered for so long. 1 year to the day after Maria Jenkins was found alive in her coffin, the current occupant of the Jenkins family home reported a strange discovery. In what had been Maria's bedroom, they found the floor covered in a fine blue powder. In the center was a perfect circle containing what appeared to be footprints, one set walking into the circle and a different, smaller set walking out. Forensic analysis identified the first set as matching Maria Jenkins' foot size and gait. The second set belonged to a child approximately 5 years old. The homeowners reported hearing a child's laughter in the house at night, though they had no children. Security cameras occasionally captured glimpses of a small figure with luminous blue eyes moving through the halls, always disappearing before it could be clearly seen. The family dog refused to enter certain rooms, and houseplants in these areas exhibited accelerated growth, sometimes aging from seedling to full maturity overnight. Most disturbing were the child's drawings that would appear on previously blank papers left around the house, crude renderings of the map pattern becoming more sophisticated with each passing week. Research into the Jenkins family history revealed that Eleanor had been pregnant when she disappeared during the expedition 15 years earlier. Hospital records confirmed she was in her second trimester, expecting a girl. Investigators began to consider the horrifying possibility that Maria hadn't simply traveled through time. She had been transformed into a vessel for something else, something that had used her and her mother's remains to create a bridge between different points in time. The child's footprints suggested that whatever had returned through that bridge was neither fully Maria nor fully human. Meanwhile, academic institutions worldwide reported an epidemic of obsession among cartographers, geographers, and theoretical physicists. Graduate students abandoned their dissertation research to work on mapping projects related to the pattern. Distinguished professors were found covering their office walls with fragments of the map. The world's leading temporal physics researcher, Dr. Eliza Maury, published a revolutionary paper proposing that time itself was not a linear progression, but a navigable landscape, before disappearing from her Tokyo apartment, leaving behind only the complete map rendered across every surface in blue ink. Most disturbing of all, a global analysis of satellite imagery revealed something that scientists are still struggling to explain. When viewed from precisely the right altitude and angle, certain geographical features, river systems, mountain ranges, and coastlines, align to form the exact pattern of the map found on Maria's skin and her mother's bones. These alignments should be statistically impossible, yet they exist across 6 continents. Carbon dating of soil and rock samples from key intersection points in these alignments showed wild inconsistencies, with some samples appearing to be millions of years younger than the surrounding terrain, others registering as temporally inverted, seemingly aging backward. A classified governmental study detected trace amounts of the blue fungal organism at each of these geographical intersection points, dormant but intact. More alarming was the discovery that the organism's growth patterns matched exactly those of human neural networks, as if the entire planet had been subtly rewired with a mycelial nervous system following the map's pattern. Environmental scientists monitoring these sites recorded electromagnetic anomalies that pulsed in 13-second intervals, strengthening with each passing month. The final piece of the puzzle emerged when archaeologists, working at a newly discovered ancient site in Turkey, uncovered a chamber dating back approximately 11,000 years. On its walls was the now familiar map, rendered in a blue mineral pigment that tests show contains spores of the same fungal organism found on Eleanor Jenkins' remains. The chamber predated all known human settlements in the region by several thousand years, challenging established archaeological timelines. What terrified researchers wasn't just the map's presence, but the chamber's contents. 13 female skeletons arranged in a circular pattern, each with the now familiar threading through their bones. At the center of the circle was a 14th skeleton, a child of approximately 5 years old, whose bones showed signs of extraordinary mutation. The child's skull had developed additional sutures and plates, creating spaces for what forensic anthropologists could only describe as additional brain lobes that wouldn't exist in Homo sapiens. DNA extracted from these remains contained sequences that geneticists claimed were evolutionarily impossible, the same sequences found in the cellular samples from the Jenkins family. Carbon dating places the age of these spores at more than 40,000 years, predating not just the chamber, but Homo sapiens' presence in the region. Yet more recent layers of the chamber showed evidence of being accessed repeatedly throughout human history. Ancient Sumerian artifacts lay alongside Roman coins, medieval religious symbols, and items from the Victorian era. Most disturbing was the discovery of a modern digital storage device embedded in the chamber wall, containing encrypted files that, when finally decoded, revealed detailed research notes from Eleanor Jenkins, dated 3 years after her supposed death. Beside the map was an inscription, repeated in 13 different ancient languages, recently translated to read, "The mothers will return when the maps align again." Below this, in modern English, someone had scratched, "She is not my daughter anymore. What grows inside her will walk between worlds." E.J. That alignment, according to astronomical calculations based on the coordinates in the map, will occur in exactly 7 years from today. Analysis of global weather patterns, tectonic activity, and electromagnetic field fluctuations suggests that the planet itself is somehow being prepared for this event. The blue fungal organism, once confined to specific locations, has now been detected in trace amounts in water systems worldwide. Children born within the past year show subtle but measurable differences in brain development, specifically in regions associated with spatial reasoning and temporal perception. The Jenkins family plot in the local cemetery remains under 24-hour surveillance. The coffin that once contained Maria and her mother's remains has been sealed in concrete and titanium. Yet, cemetery workers report that on certain nights, particularly when the moon is full, a fine blue dust can be seen seeping through the seals, arranging itself into what appears to be coordinates that change slightly each time, as if counting down. More disturbing are the reports of a small child seen visiting the grave, a girl of about 5 with luminous blue eyes who leaves tiny footprints that, when mapped, form another piece of the pattern. Security cameras never capture this visitor, though multiple witnesses describe her with perfect consistency. Several guards who have spotted her have subsequently developed the now familiar blue markings on their skin and begun experiencing temporal distortions, seeing brief glimpses of past and future versions of themselves overlaid on reality. The government team studying the Jenkins case has itself become compromised. 3 lead researchers have disappeared, leaving behind only rooms filled with iterations of the map. Others report dreams of being guided through impossible landscapes by a child with Maria's face and Eleanor's voice, who points to locations on a living map that pulses like a heart. The project director recently instituted mandatory psychological evaluations after discovering that 60% of the research staff had independently tattooed fragments of the map onto their bodies in hidden locations. Last month, a manuscript, allegedly written by Professor Jenkins, appeared simultaneously in the offices of 13 different academic publications worldwide. The paper, titled Cartography of the Temporal Landscape, Fungal Networks as 5-Dimensional Transit Systems, contained information so complex that mathematicians claimed it would have taken centuries of human advancement to develop. More disturbing was the fact that readers reported different content depending on when they read it, as if the text itself existed in multiple temporal states simultaneously. Those who studied the manuscript too closely began experiencing symptoms now recognized as temporal slippage, experiencing memories out of sequence, perceiving multiple potential futures simultaneously, or becoming temporarily unstuck in time, appearing to flicker in and out of reality to outside observers. The manuscript has been classified as a memetic hazard of the highest order, but digital copies continue to circulate online, spreading the temporal infection to new hosts. Last week, 13 women in 13 different countries gave birth simultaneously to children with luminous blue eyes. Each mother reported the same dream during labor, being guided through an impossible city by a small child who told them they were helping to draw the mother's home. Medical scans show that these newborns have unprecedented neural development and trace amounts of the blue fungal organism integrated with their central nervous systems. Attempts to quarantine these children have failed. They seem to exist in a state of quantum uncertainty, sometimes appearing in multiple locations simultaneously. What truly happened to Maria Jenkins remains unclear. Was she, as her father's notes suggest,
transformed into a human gateway between different points in time? Did she herself become one of the mysterious mothers who exist outside our linear temporal framework? Or was she merely the first host for something that has been waiting for millennia to re-enter our reality? Patient cartographers mapping their way back into our world through the neural pathways of human minds. The growing consensus among those still sane enough to study the phenomenon is that Maria Jenkins no longer exists as a singular entity. She has become what theoretical physicists call a temporal watershed, a nexus point from which multiple timelines flow backward and forward.
The child seen at her grave and in her former home may be her daughter, born in a different timeline, or perhaps something else entirely, a hybrid being that exists simultaneously in multiple temporal streams. As the 7-year countdown to the alignment continues, more people worldwide report dreams of being guided through impossible landscapes by a woman with map-like patterns on her skin and a child with glowing blue eyes. They wake with fragments of coordinates in their minds and an irresistible compulsion to draw the pattern. The blue fungus has been detected in increasing concentrations in water supplies, soil samples, and even the atmosphere. Microscopic spores spreading the temporal infection across the planet. What do you think happened to Maria Jenkins? Was she truly navigating through time as her father believed, or was she the victim of something more sinister? Perhaps an ancient organism using human hosts to spread across time itself. Could the mysterious mothers be future evolved humans attempting to communicate with their past, or something entirely non-human that existed before our conception of time began? Have you ever found strange patterns in nature that seem too perfect to be coincidental? Remember to leave your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more unexplained historical mysteries. And maybe, just maybe, check your skin carefully tonight before you go to sleep, because some say those who learn about the map might find its patterns beginning to appear on their own bodies, especially in dreams. The mothers are always seeking new cartographers, new vessels to help them find their way home.